What if the man you mocked in front of everyone didn't yell, didn't fight back, didn't even ask questions, but quietly took notes, called his lawyer, and destroyed your plans with one signature? What if the joke you made for attention cost you your wedding, your reputation, and your future overnight? I always told myself it was just my sense of humor, that Nathan was too serious to laugh at anything, that maybe teasing him a little would make him loosen up. At the engagement dinner, when I joked about my 50-something hookups before meeting him, everyone laughed except Nathan. He just sat there, calm and polite, like nothing touched him at all. I told Caitlin afterward he was overreacting, that it was just a joke, that people needed to stop being so uptight. She said maybe I should apologize, but I didn't see the point. Nathan never said a word that night, not in the car, not at home, not even when Margaret left the table early, her face tight with anger. I told myself silence meant forgiveness, or at least indifference, and I liked that version of the story better than any other. What I didn't know was that while I was busy making jokes, Nathan was busy planning something else entirely, something he never warned me about until it was too late to undo. The engagement dinner was supposed to be a celebration. At least that's what I kept telling myself as I stood in front of the mirror that evening, adjusting the necklace Nathan had given me for my birthday 3 months ago. He had barely said a word about tonight, other than the time and the place. And I told Caitlin on the phone that it was typical of him to treat everything like a business meeting. She laughed when I said I'd have to provide the entertainment since my future husband didn't know how to. By the time we arrived at the city bistro, most of our friends and family were already seated, the long table set with flowers and champagne, everyone smiling as if nothing in the world could possibly go wrong. Nathan pulled out my chair, like the gentleman he always was, calm, polite, steady, and maybe a little too composed for my taste. I wanted him to relax, to laugh, to stop acting like life was one long spreadsheet. So when someone asked how we met, I made a joke about how I had to sort through a small army of bad dates before finding Nathan, how maybe the 50th one finally got it right, and everyone laughed except Nathan. Margaret, his mother, frowned slightly but said nothing, sipping her wine like she was already tired of me. I told myself it was harmless, that people expected a little teasing at events like this, that Nathan needed to learn to take a joke if he was going to marry someone like me. When the waiter brought the appetizers, Caitlin leaned in and whispered that I might want to dial it back, but I shook my head and told her Nathan knew I was just kidding. At least, that was the story I preferred to believe. As the evening went on, the jokes got bolder. I told one about how my dating life could have filled a small library before Nathan came along, how some of my past flings still sent me messages now and then, nothing serious, of course, and people laughed again, except Margaret, who set down her glass with a sharp click that made Caitlin glance nervously between us. Nathan, meanwhile, simply cut his steak and ate in silence, not once looking up as if he were listening, but choosing not to participate. I told Caitlin later that night he was being dramatic, that a confident man wouldn't mind a few jokes at his expense, that everyone needed to stop acting like I had set the table on fire. She asked if I noticed the way Margaret had left before dessert, her mouth tight, her eyes cold, and I said Margaret never liked me much anyway, so what difference did it make? Nathan drove home in silence after paying the bill, his hands steady on the wheel, his eyes on the road like nothing in the world was worth mentioning. I told myself he was just tired, that he didn't want to argue in front of Caitlin, sitting in the back seat scrolling through her phone. When we pulled into the driveway, he took the house keys off the ring with a small metallic snap and handed them to me before walking inside alone. That night, while Caitlin and I sat in the kitchen eating leftover cake, I told her Nathan was too serious for his own good, that marriage shouldn't feel like a courtroom where every joke was a crime. She suggested maybe I should talk to him, maybe explain that I didn't mean anything by it, but I laughed and said he probably knew that already, that Nathan wasn't the type to make a scene over nothing. She said Margaret might see it differently, that the whispers at the table had already started before we left, and I told her people loved gossip too much to care what was true. Nathan stayed in his office the rest of the evening, the door closed, no sounds from inside except the occasional rustle of papers. I told Caitlin he was just sulking, that he would get over it like he always did, that this was how Nathan handled everything. Quiet, contained, dull as ever. But as I cleared the dishes and turned off the lights, I remembered the look on his face when I told the biggest joke of the night. The one about how I had stopped counting after 50 because what woman keeps track forever, and how the table had gone quiet except for two people laughing too hard to notice the silence spreading around them. Nathan hadn't looked angry or embarrassed or even hurt. He had just looked still, like a man who had already decided something while everyone else kept talking. I told myself it didn't matter, that tomorrow he would go back to work, Margaret would go back to her book club, and I would go back to planning the wedding like tonight never happened. But when I went upstairs later, the office door was still shut, the light still on, and Nathan's car keys were missing from the hook by the door, even though it was nearly midnight. I stood there for a long time before going to bed alone, telling myself none of this meant anything at all. The next morning, Nathan left early without saying much, just a brief nod before heading out the door, his car already running by the time I walked into the kitchen. Caitlin asked if we were okay, and I told her Nathan was probably just embarrassed about last night, that he would get over it like he always did. She gave me a look I didn't appreciate, the kind that suggested she wanted to say something but thought better of it. I told her not to worry, that Nathan knew I was joking, that everyone was making too big a deal out of one silly comment about my past. At work later that day, I repeated the story to my coworkers, adding extra details to make it sound funnier than it really was. They laughed when I said Nathan's face looked like someone had cancelled Christmas, and I told them he was too serious for his own good, that maybe marriage would loosen him up a little. One of them asked if Nathan had ever said how many women he'd been with before me, and I laughed and said probably 2 if we were being generous, maybe 3 if we counted high school sweethearts. They laughed even harder, and I pretended not to notice the coworker in the corner, scrolling through her phone with a smirk like she was already texting someone the story. At lunch, I met Elliot for coffee, the old flame I sometimes talked to when Nathan was working late. It was harmless, at least that's what I told myself, because Elliot didn't want anything serious and neither did I. He asked if I was nervous about the wedding, and I told him not really, that Nathan wasn't exactly the romantic type, but at least he was dependable. Elliot raised an eyebrow and said dependable didn't sound very exciting, and I laughed and told him excitement was overrated. Still, when he walked me back to the office, standing too close and smiling too much, I didn't exactly tell him to stop. That evening, Caitlin mentioned that Margaret had called her, asking if I was serious about what I'd said at dinner, and I told Caitlin to tell Margaret to mind her own business. Caitlin said Margaret was worried about Nathan, that people were already whispering about the joke, wondering if there was more to it than I was letting on. I told her people love drama too much to let the truth get in the way, that Margaret had never liked me anyway, so of course she would assume the worst. Caitlin said maybe I should talk to Nathan before things got worse, but I told her he didn't care enough to ask me anything, so why should I care enough to explain? Nathan came home late that night, quiet as usual, sitting at the table while Caitlin and I finished dinner. He asked about our day in the same calm tone he always used, no edge in his voice, no sign that anything was wrong at all. I told Caitlin later it proved I was right, that he wasn't nearly as upset as everyone thought, that he had probably already moved on. But as I loaded the dishwasher, I noticed Nathan scrolling through his phone, the screen lighting up his face while he read something for a long time without saying a word. When I asked what it was, he just said work emails and put the phone away. 2 days later, one of my coworkers mentioned seeing Nathan talking to someone outside a law office downtown, a man in a suit carrying a briefcase. I laughed and said Nathan was probably fixing some paperwork for the wedding, that he was too responsible to leave anything to chance. Still, I felt something twist in my stomach when she said he looked serious, like he was signing something important. That night, when I asked Nathan about it, he said he was just taking care of a few things before the wedding and changed the subject. I told Caitlin it was proof he wasn't bothered by the dinner joke at all, that if he was, he would have said something by now instead of worrying about paperwork. But later, when I walked past his office, the door was closed again, the light on under the crack, and I heard the low murmur of his voice like he was on the phone with someone. I stood there for a long time, wondering why he needed to close the door for a work call. Why his voice sounded so steady and calm, like he was reading off a list. I told myself it was nothing, that Nathan didn't have a dramatic bone in his body, that if something was wrong, he would have already confronted me. Still, when he came to bed hours later without saying goodnight, I couldn't quite fall asleep, no matter how many times I told myself everything was fine. By the end of the week, the story about my so-called 50 hookups had spread farther than I expected, showing up in half-laughing conversations at work, and even in a few text messages from friends who hadn't been at the dinner but clearly had all the details. I told Caitlin it was ridiculous how people loved to exaggerate, how one little joke had turned into some kind of scandal, and she asked if I'd noticed how quiet Nathan had been since that night. I said he was always quiet, that it didn't mean anything, that Nathan just wasn't the type to get worked up about gossip. Still, I couldn't ignore how he had started eating dinner alone in the kitchen before disappearing into his office for hours, the door locked, his car gone in the mornings before I even woke up. One afternoon, Margaret stopped by the house unexpectedly, saying she needed to talk. She asked if I realized how embarrassed Nathan must have felt at the engagement dinner, how hurtful it was to make a joke like that in front of his entire family. I told her Nathan was overreacting, that it was just humor, that people needed to stop taking everything so seriously. Margaret said it wasn't humor when half the table went silent and the other half started whispering. She said Nathan deserved someone who respected him, not someone who turned his life into a punchline. I told her Nathan didn't seem upset at all, that he hadn't even mentioned it, so clearly he wasn't as offended as she wanted to believe. She looked at me for a long time before shaking her head and leaving without another word. Later that night, I told Caitlin that Margaret had always been against me, that she probably hated the fact Nathan was marrying someone who didn't come from the same neat little world she lived in. Caitlin said Margaret might have a point, that maybe I'd gone too far, but I told her everyone was too sensitive these days. Caitlin asked if I had talked to Nathan directly, and I said there was no need, because if he had a problem, he would say so. She gave me that same look she'd given me after the dinner, the one that made me feel like I was missing something obvious. At work the next day, one of my co-workers mentioned seeing Nathan at the coffee shop across from the law office again, this time talking to the same man in the suit. I laughed it off, saying Nathan was probably sorting out the prenup or getting paperwork ready for the wedding, that it was just like him to be overly organized about everything. But the way she said it, how serious he looked, how focused, stuck with me longer than I wanted it to. That evening, Nathan came home later than usual, carrying a folder under his arm, his face unreadable as he walked past me to his office without even sitting down for dinner. I told Caitlin he was just stressed with work, that wedding planning was probably overwhelming him, but she didn't look convinced. She said maybe I should try apologizing before things got worse, but I told her there was nothing to apologize for because I hadn't done anything wrong. 2 days later, Margaret called Caitlin instead of me, saying Nathan was staying with her for a few nights to think things over. I laughed when Caitlin told me, saying he was probably just tired of the noise at our house, that Margaret was exaggerating as usual. But when I texted Nathan asking if he was coming home, he just replied that he was busy and would be back soon. No explanation, no details, nothing at all for me to argue with. That weekend, I went to lunch with friends, telling the story again, turning it into something funny for their amusement. I said Nathan was probably sulking because he didn't like being teased in public, that he would get over it like he always did. But when I came home, the house felt different, colder somehow. Nathan's office door was locked again, and a stack of unopened mail sat on the counter with my name on half the envelopes. Caitlin asked if I was sure everything was fine, and I told her Nathan just needed space before the wedding, that Margaret was probably filling his head with nonsense. But late that night, when I passed by his office on my way to bed, I thought I heard voices inside. Nathan's low and steady, another man's firmer, more official somehow. I stood there for a moment, listening through the door, before walking away quickly when the sound of paper shuffling made me feel like I was hearing something I wasn't supposed to. By Monday morning, Nathan was leaving the house before sunrise, his car engine starting, while the rest of the street was still dark and silent. Caitlin asked if I was worried, and I told her no, that Nathan was probably just working extra hours to pay for the wedding, that everyone was turning this into something bigger than it was. She said Margaret had called again, asking if Nathan was okay, and I told her Margaret was the one making this into a drama, not me. I said Nathan was calm because he knew nothing was actually wrong, that if there was a real problem, he would have told me by now. At work that day, one of my co-workers showed me a photo someone had taken downtown. Nathan walking into the law office with that same man in the suit. I laughed like it didn't bother me, saying Nathan was probably signing insurance papers or finalizing something boring like that. Still, the thought sat heavy in my chest all afternoon. No matter how many times I told myself Nathan didn't have a single dramatic bone in his body. When I got home, Caitlin said Margaret had stopped by again but left when she realized Nathan wasn't there. She asked if I was sure he wasn't upset, and I told her Nathan was quiet by nature, that he hated arguments, that this was probably his way of avoiding unnecessary tension. That evening, Nathan came home carrying another folder under his arm, walking straight past me into his office like he had the night before. I told Caitlin it was work stuff, that Nathan was probably too busy to even think about the dinner anymore, but the way he locked the door behind him made something twist in my stomach. Later, when I passed by on my way to the kitchen, I heard the low sound of his voice reading something out loud, steady and calm, like he was going through a checklist with someone on speakerphone. I told myself it had to be about wedding logistics or taxes, anything boring enough for Nathan to sound that focused. 2 days later, a message popped up in the family group chat from Margaret, saying she wanted to host a small lunch for both families before the wedding. Caitlin said it might be a chance to smooth things over, but I told her there was nothing to smooth over, that Nathan would show up, smile politely like always, and everyone would see this was all in their heads. When I told Nathan about it that evening, he just nodded and said he would be there, his voice polite but flat, like he was agreeing to a meeting rather than a family meal. At the lunch, Margaret was friendly but stiff, serving food and making conversation mostly with Caitlin and Nathan while barely looking at me. I told a funny story about work to break the tension, exaggerating some details to make people laugh, and Caitlin smiled weakly, but Nathan didn't react at all. When I said maybe Margaret could help with some wedding details, Nathan said calmly that we might not need to worry about them much longer. Everyone froze for a second, but before I could ask what he meant, he changed the subject to Caitlin's new job like nothing happened. After lunch, Nathan left early, saying he had an appointment. Margaret looked at me like she wanted to say something but didn't, and Caitlin asked on the way home if I knew where he was going. I told her Nathan was probably running errands, that he was always like this before big events, focused, quiet, disappearing for hours until everything was perfect. Still, when I got home and saw the stack of mail growing on the counter, several envelopes addressed to both of us but unopened, I felt a strange weight settle in my chest. That night, when Nathan came back, he went straight to his office again. I told Caitlin I was getting tired of the constant paperwork, the phone calls, the locked doors. She said maybe I should ask him directly what was going on, but I told her Nathan hated confrontation, that he would tell me when he was ready. Still, I stood outside his office for a long time after midnight, hearing only the sound of papers sliding across a desk and Nathan's low, even voice speaking to someone I couldn't quite hear. On Thursday morning, Nathan left before I was even out of bed, the sound of the front door closing drifting upstairs as I stared at the ceiling, telling myself he was probably running another errand for the wedding. Caitlin said she'd heard him on the phone late last night again, his voice steady and calm, never raised, never hurried, like he had everything already planned out. I told her Nathan was just like that, methodical about everything, never rushing, never explaining until things were finished. She asked if I was sure this wasn't about the dinner joke, that maybe he was angrier than I thought, and I told her Nathan didn't get angry. He got quiet, and quiet meant he wasn't going to fight about it. That afternoon, I was at work when a man in a dark suit walked in carrying a large envelope. He asked for me by name, while my co-workers looked over curiously, the room falling silent as he handed me the envelope and left without a word. I opened it at my desk expecting contracts or insurance paperwork, something routine, but instead found formal documents with words like petition, termination, and reclamation of assets printed across the top. There were signatures at the bottom, Nathan's, his lawyer's, a notary's stamp in black ink. My chest felt tight as I flipped through pages about cancelled wedding contracts, division of finances, return of property, all written in clear legal language that left nothing to question. My co-workers whispered behind me, watching as I shoved everything back into the envelope and stood there not knowing what to say. When I got home, Caitlin was sitting at the kitchen table, the same kind of envelope in front of her, already opened. She said Margaret had dropped it off earlier, that Nathan had given instructions for everyone to be informed properly. I told Caitlin this was ridiculous, that Nathan was overreacting to one joke, that he couldn't possibly mean to call off an entire wedding over something so small. Caitlin said it wasn't just the joke, that people had been talking for weeks, that Nathan had probably heard more than I realized. I told her gossip didn't mean anything, that Margaret had probably been filling his head with poison, that this was her way of getting rid of me before the marriage even started. Margaret called that evening, her voice calm but sharp, saying Nathan had spoken to his lawyer about everything and that the decision was final. She said the wedding venue had been contacted, the deposits returned, the announcements cancelled. I told her she was interfering, that she had always wanted Nathan to marry someone else, but she only said Nathan was doing what was best for himself. Caitlin sat there the whole time listening as I paced the kitchen, telling both of them that this was insane, that Nathan hadn't even talked to me before making all these decisions. Margaret said Nathan didn't owe me a conversation after the way I'd treated him publicly, that his silence had been my warning and I hadn't listened. That night, I waited for Nathan to come home, rehearsing what I would say, how I would make him see that everyone was twisting things, that the joke didn't mean anything, that people love drama too much to leave well enough alone. When he finally walked in carrying another folder under his arm, he didn't even pause in the hallway. He went straight to his office, closed the door, and stayed there until after midnight. I knocked once, asking if we could talk, and he said he was busy, but we would discuss everything in due time. His voice was calm, too calm, like the kind of calm that comes after a storm instead of before one. The next morning, more envelopes arrived, bank statements, copies of contracts, receipts for deposits with Nathan's signature authorizing refunds. Caitlin said he must have been planning this for weeks, gathering documents, making calls, setting everything in motion, while I told everyone he didn't care enough to be upset. I told her he was being cruel, that he was letting Margaret push him into this, that he was trying to humiliate me on purpose. But deep down, watching him leave the house again without looking back, I felt something colder than anger growing in the pit of my stomach, something that told me this wasn't about Margaret or gossip or even the joke anymore. This was about Nathan making sure he didn't leave anything undone, about him ending things in a way no one could undo once it was finished. The courthouse smelled like old paper and rain-soaked coats, the kind of place where everything felt too quiet, even with people walking around. Caitlin came with me because Margaret had made it clear she wouldn't be on my side. Not after the dinner, not after the gossip, not after weeks of watching Nathan walk in and out of that law office with a folder under his arm. Nathan was already there when we arrived, standing next to his lawyer, dressed like he was going to work instead of ending an engagement. He didn't look at me, didn't wave, didn't even nod when Caitlin and I sat down across the aisle. The judge read through the documents slowly, his voice flat and steady, while I kept waiting for Nathan to change his mind, to interrupt and say maybe this had all gone too far. He never did. The lawyer presented signed statements from the venue, the caterer, the bank, even the travel agency handling the honeymoon, each one showing Nathan had reversed everything neatly and legally. There were receipts with refund confirmations, notices of cancelled contracts, letters dissolving joint accounts I hadn't even known existed. Caitlin whispered that he must have been preparing this since the week after the dinner, maybe even before that, but I shook my head because I didn't want to believe it. When the judge asked if there were any objections, I stood up and said the whole thing was unnecessary, that this was about a joke people had blown out of proportion, that Nathan was letting gossip ruin something we could have fixed with one conversation. Nathan didn't look at me. He didn't say a single word while the judge reminded me everything presented was legal, binding, and already in motion before I even opened that first envelope at work. It felt like standing in the middle of a storm, after all the lightning had already struck. Nothing left to stop, only the damage left behind. Margaret sat behind Nathan, her hands folded neatly in her lap, watching me the way someone watches a stranger on the street. Caitlin stayed quiet beside me, glancing back and forth like she wasn't sure where to look. I told the judge Nathan was overreacting, that everyone had laughed at the dinner, that he was throwing away a wedding over nothing. The judge read another page out loud: financial transfers, contract dissolutions, property agreements, and said the matter was closed. Nathan's lawyer thanked him politely before gathering the folders, like this was just another day at the office. When it was over, Nathan finally turned toward me, not angry, not bitter, not triumphant, just calm in a way that made my stomach twist. He told the judge he had nothing further to add, then walked out with his lawyer and Margaret without saying a single word to me. Caitlin touched my arm like she wanted to say something but didn't, her eyes following Nathan as he disappeared through the courthouse doors into the grey afternoon. I told her this wasn't fair, that people had made the joke bigger than it was, that Margaret had been waiting for me to slip up, that Nathan should have talked to me before ending everything like this. Caitlin didn't answer. She just stood there holding her coat, like she wasn't sure if staying next to me was the right thing to do anymore. Outside the courthouse, Nathan's car pulled away from the curb, with Margaret in the passenger seat and the lawyer in the back, none of them looking in my direction. Caitlin asked if I wanted to go home, but the word home felt strange now, like something I wasn't sure belonged to me anymore. I told her Nathan had planned this whole thing quietly, while I kept telling everyone he didn't care enough to do anything at all. She didn't disagree. By the time we left, the rain had started again, soft at first, then heavier, washing down the courthouse steps, while I stood there with the envelope full of final documents, all stamped and signed, no space left for arguments or explanations. Nathan had done it all legally, cleanly, without shouting or blaming, or anything messy for people to talk about later. He hadn't even raised his voice once. And as Caitlin and I walked to the car, I realized that was the worst part, that he had ended everything so neatly. There was nothing left for me to fight against, nothing left to fix, nothing left at all. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching.